Hello. So today we are going to talk about Vue component, and this is basically a library that was developed by GitHub with the idea of reinventing the Vue layer of a Ruby on Rails application. So at the moment we've got our views folder, we've got lots of partials, we've got decorators, we've got application helpers, and the idea of Vue components is that it can actually replace it all. So it brings kind of front-end React kind of style of development into Ruby on Rails application. So instead of having partials, we would have Vue components, and they can actually also replace views. And the cool thing is that they are reusable and they are testable. So you can easily test each component and know what you will expect to see. And also there are some cool features like previewing Vue components. So here is a real case scenario. There's this really cool article about some guys that were building a project management application, and they ended up having lots and lots of partials and partials inside partials. And it really decreased the loading speed of their application. And basically, if you have lots of Vue components and Vue components inside Vue components, it still performs much better than using partials. So now we are going to explore using the components in a real Ruby on Rails application. So here I've got an application. Basically, I've got a list of posts. So each post is a partial. That we've got a progress bar partial. We've got our user's logo that is visible in the nav bar. We've got a user's logo here. If we go to my profile, we have these things that can be moved into a separate component, like these boolean labels that are described in our helpers, application helper, boolean label. So now we're going to try to implement a few Vue components. Okay, let's go to the guide, getting started. And let's install the gem Vue component, require Vue component engine. I'm going to add this to the gem file and run bundle. So first of all, we will try to replace these labels with the Vue components. Basically, instead of having a boolean label value, we are going to render a Vue component for each of these cases. So at the moment, we have a boolean label with a value, and instead we are going to create a component. So Rails generate component. Let's name the component as boolean label, and it will have a param of value. And what does it create? It created a test file, and it created a new folder in our app. So here we have app, components, and inside the components we have a .rb file and an HTML file. Now basically this .rb file should describe the behavior of the HTML file, and we can actually already try to display this Vue component somewhere inside our application. Let's start the server, and let's say I'll go to the root page of our app and try to display this component that we have just generated. So going to static public landing page, and I will say equals render boolean label component dot new, and we need to pass in some kind of value. So I will say value equals ABC, for example. And what will we get? So we have the HTML rendered here, but we don't have this value displayed anywhere. Well, we can actually display the value by saying equals at value. And here we have this ABC. Okay, now let's try to move the logic of this application helper boolean label into our boolean label component. I'll take it out of there and put it here. Now it will be in a private method. And here we have, so we are going to define the badge color. It will be either badge with the background success or with danger. So danger is red. Okay, and we are going to have this content tag not in our .rb file, but in the HTML file. So we'll have content tag span, value, badge color. Now here we have the value and the badge color. And if we define the badge color, based on what we have in our params here. So either true or false. Let's see if we get anything. Okay, we get this undefined local variable or method value. Why is it so? Because we have this content tag span value, but we don't have at value. Now let's try making at value. And we would also make at value here. And here we have this ABC. Of course, it is without a badge because it is not true and not false. So I will say else. And if the value is not true and not false, let's say badge background secondary. Okay, so here we have this other background if the value is not true and not false. Now let's say the value will be true. I'll actually render a different component with the value true. And here we have the same, but with the value true, and it is with success. Now we can actually remove all this other text that we don't need anymore. I'll remove it from here. And let's see. Okay, looks good. And we'll also render a component with the value false. Let's see what it gives us. So here we have a component with the value false. Okay, looks good. Now we can actually do one more thing. We can say that we don't need this at. We will just have value here and here. And instead, we will just say attribute reader value. Like this. And it should work just as before. Okay, looks good. So you see, now we are previewing 3 of our view components and actually 3 states of the same view component. And now we can try using this view component somewhere in our application. For example, inside our user partial, instead of this boolean label. So I'm just going to render the boolean label component with a specific value. Now let's go to our users, user partial. And here, instead of rendering the boolean label, they're going to render the boolean label component. And the value is going to be based on a user state. So user confirmed or user created by invite or user invitation is set at. Okay, so looks good. Now we've just replaced our helper with the view component. And actually we can do a lot of cool stuff with these view components. For example, we can preview them. So the same way we can go to /rails/mailers to preview a view component, to preview an email, we can also preview the view components. So we can actually create some previews now. We would go to our test, components, create a folder named preview or previews, and here we would have a file named boolean label component preview.rb. And let's see what the code should be like. So we'll go to previews. Here is an example. So we will say boolean label component preview. And we will render boolean label component with a value that will be true, for example. And we will say when true. And we can render the other states of the component. So we'll say when false and also when other. And let's have a look at these components. Now I think we need to restart the Rails server so that it takes effect. So when we edit something in our view component previews, we would need to restart the server. And let's click on when false. Is it when false? Okay, yeah, I should actually change it to false. Now reload. Okay, now it is red. Now let's go to the other states. So when other. Here we have just this text and when true. So looks good. Now we can preview our components and also we can also test them. So let's go to our test, and here is an example test. So we can assert equal, and we can expect some particular HTML to be rendered and compare the HTML rendered by the view component to the HTML that we want to actually have. So let's test when true. And we will run the boolean label component with a value that will be true and say to HTML. And let's run the test. I will say Rails test. Okay, we get some error. Let's see. Okay, violates unique constraint. Actually, I will need to go to fixtures, users, and add some basic fixtures for users. So there should be users with the emails. Let's say one email will be one@superrails.com, and two will be two@superrails.com. Okay, let's try running the tests once again. Rails test. Okay, so we managed to run the test, and we were expecting this HTML, but we got this HTML rendered. Now let's see. I will go back, and what do we expect? We expect span with a class, badge, background success, and inside we would have the word true. Let's see if it works. I'll run Rails test, and it is nearly the same, but here you see we have this extra line. Now let's go back to our HTML view of the component. Here we actually have this extra line, so we need to remove it. Okay, I'm running Rails test once again, and you see the tests are passing. So looks good. And the same way we can test the other states of our component. So I will also test when false, and let's actually have a look at other default options that we can have with testing. So I'll go to testing, and here we can assert a selector or text to be present. So let's try these other options. I'm going to render inline the boolean label component with a value false, and I will assert the presence of a class that has badge and badge or background danger, and the text that I expect is false. Okay, and here I can also assert a text to be false. I'm running Rails test, and the test passes. And let's assert the other option. So when other, test when other, and the label will be, let's say, ABC, and the selector that we expect to have is badge secondary. Text would be ABC, and here it would be again ABC. Rails test, and it works. So the tests are running. Okay, and this is basically how we can test a view component. Again, it is kind of isolated from the whole application logic, and just from our application, when we render a view component, we can pass anything that we want inside the params. So let's go and do another example. So now we did our boolean label component. Let's actually do something possibly more complicated. For example, a user avatar. So here we have a user avatar. We also have the avatar inside the users list and also inside our posts. So if a user has an avatar is rendered. Let's create one more component. I'll run the command Rails generate component avatar. And what does an avatar have? Now, what does an image usually have? Let's have a look at an image tag. It has the source, it has the size, it has a class, and can also have an alt. So let's say avatar, src is for source, then alt, size, and yeah, I guess that's it for now. So let's generate the component. And here it is. Again, we've got an .rb file and html.eib file. And here we're going to have our image tag. So let's say equals image tag. Now here we're going to have the source, then we're going to have the size, then we're going to have the alt, and then we're going to have a class. So let's say that the class is always going to be the same. It's going to be the one that we've got here. So class, rounded circle, and so on. I'll input the class here, and let's try rendering this component somewhere. So for example, inside our user partial. So I will say equals render avatar component dot new, and we need to pass in some params. So we'll need to have src. The source would be user.image. Then we would have the size. That would be 30, for example. And we would have an alt. That would be the user's name. So it will be user.name. And let's see if this works. I'm going to refresh the page and go to our users. Okay, Rails server. Now going to a user page. And I get this undefined local variable for src. Okay, so we need to go and add these attribute readers. So attribute reader, src, alt, and size. Now let's refresh, and the image gets rendered. So looks good. Now let's go to the list of all the users, and you see nil location provided cannot build URI. Now, why is it so? Because some of the users do not have images. So let's render the image only if it can be rendered, and it can be rendered if the user has an image. Now, the easy thing we can do is just copy this logic and put it right here. But there is a better way of conditional rendering than this. So view components have such a thing as render, conditional rendering. So we can say render if true or if false. So let's pass a variable for when we need to render it. Let's say comma render, or let's say display, and we will display this image if the user has an image. Then we are going to display this component. And now we need to pass in this param of display into our avatar component. So we will also add it here, display, and we will say def render if we can display. So if display is set to true, then we can render this avatar. Let's see if it works. Okay, unknown keyword display. It is because we also need to add display here. Display equals display. Now let's see if it works. Yeah, we also need to add display here. So display. And undefined method display. So I think we can just make it like this. And looks good. So in the case when a user has an avatar, we render it, otherwise we do not. Okay, and let's have a look at some more options. So we have passed our alt. Now each image can have an alt. What is an alt? It is a text description of an image. So if we go to the image here and go to inspect, what do we have? An image has this username, the name of the user that we've passed here. And what if we don't pass an alt? Let's imagine we don't pass an alt here. What will happen? Okay, we have this missing keyword alt. But what if there are cases when we just forget to add an alt, or where we don't want to have an alt, where we will want to have just some kind of default text? Well, actually in these view components, it's really cool and easy to add defaults. So here we can just add the default title, just default title. And if we don't pass an alt, then they're going to have this default title. So Let's see, I refresh. And now I will go to this image. And if we do not pass an alt, it gets this default title. We can do the same with the image size. Let's imagine what if we pass the size to be not 30, but 300. So the image is bigger. But if we don't pass any size, what do we get? We get this error. So we can also add a default value for the size. Let's go to our size and say that by default, it's going to be 30, meaning 30 in width and 30 in height. Okay, so looks good. And you see, we added a few defaults and we don't have to type them all inside our render of the component, but when we want to override them, we can do it really easily. So at the moment, we've just got the source, it's the user image, and display if it is present. So looks good. And now we can reuse the same component around our application. So again, I'll go back and add an alt. It will be user.name and size. Let's say it will be 50. And I will just check if it's working. I will remove this image tag and also go to our other places around our application, to our posts. And here, instead of this image tag, I'm also going to render the partial. So actually the component, avatar component, size will be default. Alt is going to be post.user.name. SCR is going to be post.user.image, and display if post.user.image. Let's see if it works. I'm going to the list of our posts, and it's working. Now here we are rendering from this component. And let's also go to our navbar. Here we have our user image. So there we can also render our component. Let's go to layouts, header. And here we're going to have our avatar component. So we don't need this logic anymore, like if a user has an image, then image tag, and so on. We're just going to render the avatar component for current user. Image, alt, current user name, and display if the user has an image. Okay, so looks good. And here basically we've created and used two different view components. Now, what if we want to actually input a big partial into a component and create a component that has a few different components inside? Now, what if we try to move this whole user view into a separate component? This can be quite an interesting challenge. Let's try to do this. So I'll just create a new component, Rails generate component, and we'll just name it user or user view or whatever. So we'll just have the user component, and we're going just to pass one attribute. It's going to be the user ID. So user component with one attribute user. Let's see what we got. We have this user component, and we have this .rb file. Okay, so what if we move all the logic from this user partial, all this HTML, into our HTML of the user component, just like this, and try to render the user component instead of our user partial. I will totally remove the user partial and go to our users index. And here, instead of rendering users, I'm going to render this collection of view components. Now let's see how we can do it. We have this render user component with collection users. So we'll say render user component. Let's see if it works. I'm going to start the app. and go to the list of users. Okay, we have this undefined local variable user. Again, we will have to go to our user component.obv and say attribute reader user. Okay, and as if nothing has changed, but we have totally removed our user's partial, and instead of rendering a user partial and a list of user partials, we are just rendering the components. So looks really interesting. And you see inside this avatar component, actually inside this user component, we are rendering two other components, the avatar component and a few boolean label components. So this way we have components inside of components. Looks cool, doesn't it? Now let's have a look at a single user record. And again, we try to render the partial. Instead of rendering the partial, we are going to render this user component. Let's go to our users show, and here we can render, instead of the partial, user component at user. Okay, let's see how we can do it. So I would maybe say user equals at user. Undefined method user component, maybe I should say .new. And it seems to be working. Now, will it work without this user? Let's see. Okay, so now we are rendering our user. And actually, what if we totally remove this show view, and just inside our user's controller, we will say that we want to render this component instead of rendering this view template. So I will try to go to our user's controller. And in the show view, I will say that I want to render user component new for this user. Let's see if there is any change here. Now I will try to add some kind of random text in the show view. So nothing is changing. It is because we are not using this show HTML view. So I can totally remove it. And what do we have inside our users? We have only an index page, and we have this user component. And I think it's really interesting that we don't have a user show, we don't have a user partial, but we are using the components instead of them. And now we can actually also try adding a few previews for our images and for our users. So if we go to Rails, view components, and here we have a preview only for our boolean label component. Let's also create a few previews for our avatar component. And for our user component. So what would it look like? Let's see. We need this view component preview. And here we have avatar component preview. Here we run the avatar component. And we're going to have a few options. Now, let's say we will render an avatar component in a few different sizes. How could we do this? Well, what if we say default, and it will be an empty method. And here we're going to create a new folder named, I guess, avatar component preview. And here we will have a file named default.html.erb. Okay, and here let's try to input some kind of random text. So I will refresh and see if we have access to this view. I will restart the server. And you see, we actually have access to this HTML template named default. And inside we have this random text. So here we can actually render a collection of avatar components. Let's try to do this. So we will have something like a few different sizes. we would say size like 10, 30, 50, 100 dot each do size, and we are going to render a few different components. So we will say render avatar component, and what are we going to pass? So we are going to pass the src, then we are going to pass the size, and we can potentially pass something else. So what do we have in our avatar component? Let's see. If we go to avatar component, so by default, we also have this display. Now, by default, let's say it will be false. So we cannot display if we have no src also. Okay, so display will be true, and we'll have to put an image source. Now, how can we do this? What if we try just adding a random image from the internet? Let's try doing that. What if we try this image? I'll try to copy the image link and place it here. Let's see if it gets rendered. So the size is going to be the size. And now I will refresh. Okay, encountered a syntax error. Let's see. Yeah, I forgot to close the braces. We get undefined for avatar component. So we'll say avatar component.new. And it works. So here we're rendering a few different images. And you see, again, this is kind of detached from your Rails application. These components can potentially live outside of your current application, and you can just preview them and add them with any kind of styling and any kind of params that your application is using. So this way you can actually have your own application style guide and preview all the components and the styling for them. And again, you see it's really versatile. So for example, for our boolean label component, we had a few different previews, like when true, when false, when other. And for our avatar, we have a collection of different sizes, and we can again use an image that is not attached to something particular in your application, but like an image in the net. So looks good. Okay, I think it's enough for now. So we've actually done quite a lot. We've created a few different components, like one component that takes the logic out of our helper and is moved into a component, the boolean label component. Another one is for image tag with our avatars. Another one is for our users, where we totally removed the show action and the user's partial and move them to a view component. And instead, in a controller, we are rendering a view component, and in our users index, we are rendering a collection of user components. So I think we did a great job in getting to know the view components a little bit on the surface. Of course, there's still always a lot to learn and to feel in real practice, but it's all up to you now. So thanks for being with me and have fun coding.